Welcome everyone to this Sage webinar. Thanks for giving us your ears for the next 30 minutes. I'm Kevin Legg, co-founder of Sage. Our guest who I'm interviewing today is Steven Gonzalez, co-founder of Sage. A couple things just before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items from me. This webinar is going to be recorded. So it will be sent out to you within the next 24 hours. Also, if you're not currently getting any of our updates or newsletters, please just go to the chat and type add me, and we'll make sure you get added to our quarterly newsletter. Additionally, this format today, we're going to be doing an interview style, so I'll be interjecting here and there as Steven talks us through the core theme today, which is reply rates and how Sage generates leads, with a couple of specific takeaways we're committed to getting through in the session today. So with that housekeeping out of the way, Steven Gonzalez, welcome to the conversation.
Thanks, Kev. If my audio drops or anything, just let me know, but I think it should be fine. Well, thanks everybody for joining today. I think for us and for me specifically, it's quite an interesting session. Especially because cold emailing and lead generation outbound is hugely important to every business, and it's kind of fun for me to basically give you guys a lot of insight into how we're doing lead generation. And so I'm hoping that you guys can maybe take a few things away, but also that you'll possibly give us a few things that we can think about on our end, because you know, this stuff isn't unique. I mean, there's a lot of lessons that we can apply. So I'd love to hear what everybody is trying out, what they're experimenting with, what's working for them, what's not working for them, and I hope we can help you out. So a bit of background about Sage: we're in the sales training space. That's as simply put as I can give it. So when we reach out to prospects, typically we're reaching out to folks who are either running a business or are running a sales team, and we're basically trying to get in meetings with them, to work with us. So that's the target audience, and that's the background that we're coming from. And I can recognize that everybody's maybe on the call has different backgrounds as well. So let's just get right into it. For me, at least, I'm just going to open this up here. So let's get right into it. So about 5 years ago, this is pretty much what I would do when you talked about outbound lead generation. We were just sending emails, and we'd open Outlook or Gmail, and we'd basically just send. We'd send to somebody who is pretty high value. Maybe we were doing a trip or something, and we'd try to get a meeting. Maybe we'd try to get a call. So there's a couple things that we can do. And typically off of that, we used to see that our average email reply rates are about 9%. And for us right now, on our first email that we send, is about 9%. Now, I don't know really what stage a lot of people are at with how automated they get with lead generation. But now this is almost always a kind of a template approach for how we think about outbound cold emailing. So typically we'll send a series of 4 emails or more, or sometimes less, to a target prospect, because I'm finding that if 9% of people reply on that first email, actually about 20% are replying from emails 2 through 4. And that number, some folks like to do longer sequences and some folks like to do shorter sequences. There's a few things that I should say here. A lot of folks, lead generation is not just emailing. There's a lot of kind of tools that you can use. You can use the phone, so you can do cold calling, which is something we did a lot in my earlier days. Social selling is a big thing now. So are you engaging with your prospects on LinkedIn or on whatever platforms they're on? I want to tell you right now that for Sage, because there's 2 of us and we need to scale our efforts as much as we can, our outbound lead generation activities pretty much only consist of cold email in a systematic way. Obviously, we're connecting and we're in mailing and we're writing to people outside, you know, like on LinkedIn. We're doing some cold calling, but from a systematic perspective, we do large sets of cold email campaigns. Each campaign typically has about 200 folks or more in the campaign. So that's just a little bit of a background on why we're talking about emails only here. So, I mean, I've set the stage for you. You know, there's a lot of sales engagement software now that you can use. We use a software called Reply.io that basically helps us to automate the sending of these 4 emails. So, for example, email 1 might go out today. Email 2, if today's a Thursday, I might have it go out next Monday or Tuesday. Email 3 might go out 5 days after that, and email 4 might go out, you know, 5 or 10 days after that. So for us, at least, you know, when you talk about emailing, you know, 200 plus people at a time in these large campaigns, having that automation really allows us to scale in a way that we never could. So sales engagement software is super important, I think, for lead generation. We just happen to use a tool within that stack called Reply.io, and happy to talk more about that if people have questions. So the principle here is, you know, we're sending 4-step sequences. And that's the basis, that's the background of what we're getting a lot of our data off of. So the first thing that we looked at when you talk about takeaways is a lot of people in our space tend to look at reply rates only. Reply rates are kind of like the end all and be all of what all the literature covers in this topic. And reply rates are fine. I mean, what we generally find is that, you know, Aaron Ross in his book Predictable Revenue, which was written about 10 years ago or so, he would say that if you're getting reply rates in the 8 to 12% range, you're doing well. If you're doing less than that, you're not. And if you're doing more than that, you're probably should keep doing something. These days, I find that 8 to 12%, you know, it depends. It depends on what your call to action is, what you're asking for. A lot of what we ask for is a face-to-face meeting with someone. So that's a little bit more of, you know, it's a little bit more commitment on the person's behalf. So basically, you know, it kind of depends, but I think as a gauge, you should be shooting for maybe 12, you know, 15% would probably be a nice reply rate. And it doesn't really mean much. And I think this is the important takeaway from this first lesson is that, you know, we're shooting at reply rates in the 20+% with Sage. We're not getting success rates or interest rates in the 20% range. We're getting interest rates that are more like in the 8 or 7 to 9% range. And I think that's super important is that you have to measure not only, and you have to look at this stuff on a yearly basis. If you're not looking at all the campaigns you're sending on an annual basis and then going back at the end of the year and reviewing the data, it really doesn't mean much for you. So we talk about, you know, Sage getting 20% reply rates. I think what we found is that, you know, our interest rates off of those replies tend to be a little bit less than half, which for us, I think that it's okay, but I think there's room for improvement. And what I specifically noticed when I was looking at a lot of our campaigns that we send is that the first email in a sequence is typically like, you know, hey, I'm Steven from this. You know, we're helping you do this and this. You know, would it make sense for us to have a meeting on this day? That's a first email. Usually that's always the highest yielding one. You can catch people, you know, if it's the right time, you catch their attention. It's the first time you're reaching out. The second email is super important. Usually it's a follow-up type of email. And then what you do in the next series of emails we can talk about later, it's kind of up to you. A lot of people like to come in and give case studies. Some folks like to, you know, reference a blog post or something like that. And then in the end of the sequence, people usually like to send what we call a breakup email. But I noticed that as our reply rates climbed, as we kind of moved through the email sequence, there's not a lot of interest that was coming out from the second, third, and fourth emails that we were sending. So I wanted to dig into that, and there's a couple things that I was kind of looking at when I really got into it. Is that, you know, you can send the first email, and then if you're just following up, hey, you know, referencing my first email, hey, I'm doing this. It's not really continuing to add value. So I think there's a couple things that, based on this, we really want to try moving forward into, you know, this year 2020, which is, it probably doesn't make sense for us, whether at scale or not, to just email only. I think what we have to do now is start adding in phone calls into our sequences. So perhaps a good sequence looks like email, email, call, and then picking up back with the emails. You probably can't do that for every single prospect that you have, unless you're really only targeting, you know, a small number of prospects. But if you're a business and you've got kind of large number of leads coming through, it might make sense to segment these lists and only really you know, call or add call steps into those who are like your most important, maybe your tier 1 type of clients.
So
The second thing,
let me just ask you here,
yeah,
for the benefit of folks listening in now and in the future, what qualifies as interest? Right, so you know, there's obviously a whole range of replies, anything from out of office to no thanks, I'm not interested, to maybe I'll talk to you later, all kinds of. So
yeah.
How were you looking at that? Because I think that's instructive for people to understand.
Yeah, so typically, I mean, if you're using a software to deliver emails, a lot of software these days is smarter than ever. It recognizes things like out of office replies. It filters out bounce rates from your sending statistics. And it can actually read, a lot of the stuff has some level of AI whereby it's reading the reply that somebody's sending you and basically kind of like gauging, hey, is this person interested? If they're interested, and that could be something like, you know, I've got, you know, would you like to have a meeting on this day and this time? And you know, they'll reply back like, sure, that sounds good, but maybe let's do it, you know, this day instead. That will actually read as an interested. And if somebody's clearly coming back and saying something like, no, thanks, or not now, or it's not a good time, then it'll read in the uninterested bucket. And I think what we do is I manually go through and I'll recategorize, because sometimes it misses it, right? So I'll recategorize things that may have shown up as interested but are actually not interested. So I'll categorize them in that way. But at the end of it, I think that the main thing is it's usually somebody who is acting positively to whatever your call to action is, Kevin. So kind of moving forward, if adding calls to the sequence, I generally think, and we generally recommend that, especially when you have, like, when you're focusing on a top tier of clients or high potential clients, high potential leads. The second thing that we're likely to start incorporating is a change in actually what our call to action is as we move throughout the sequence. So early on, I think it makes sense for us to be angling towards something that is really, you know, high probability of converting. So for Sage, as a training business, typically we're not going to sell to anybody unless they're going to take a meeting with us. So in the early stages of our sequence, I think it might make sense to angle toward getting a meeting. That might, and I think what we should do is start evolving that moving forward. So from maybe the third email onward, maybe we're angling for something else. Maybe it's just, hey, come check out our next webinar, or have your team check out our next webinar, and you can see that we're, like, you know, we're real and we're human. We're in business. So, you know, there's a couple things that you can do there, but I really recommend that, you know, if you look at your reply rates versus kind of level of interest rates, and you see that interest is less than 50% of all your replies, I think what you've got to do is kind of look into that and see what areas you can make changes. So that's a couple things. That's basically my number one takeaway is, you know, I saw that our interest rates were a little bit low. And so I think what we need to do is go back and kind of tweak the way that we think about these sequences. The second thing we did, which was quite interesting, is looking at all of our campaigns kind of together. I was looking at open rates. And open rates for me are not very interesting. They're not very sexy. It comes up when we train a lot. People are like, hey, what about your open rates? It's not really of interest for me because we're not sending newsletters here. We're typically sending very targeted one-to-one emails to a prospect. And so you need to kind of monitor open rates, but you need to make sure still that your reply and your interest levels are very high. But I was kind of taking a scan through the open rates for all of our campaigns, and I noticed that we generally sit around the 50 to 60% open rates. But we had 2 campaigns where we really bombed. We were in 20% on one and then 33% on the other. And so that kind of alarmed me, because if only 1/5 or 1/3 of everybody who's receiving our emails is actually opening it, I thought there's probably going to be some kind of a problem there. So I dug into it a little bit more. We were looking at subject lines, and I think the one thing that you'll see from all of our subject lines, and we really committed towards using one base subject line for the whole year. So we have very, very good consistency with our subject lines, which I think allows us to get some good data on other variables. But we typically use a subject line which is Sage and Johnson controls. It's really utilitarian. And we find with B2B buyers, utilitarian subject lines like that, which are not like, hey, open this email and great things will happen for you, which are more interest level subject lines. I think we find utilitarian subject lines tend to work better for people that are really busy. So if you're if you're emailing somebody in office hours, they're very busy, you might want to just keep it short and very much so to the point. And typically, we like to use that Sage and company name. It's very non-descriptive, and it could be a lot of things. It could be some kind of like merger news. It could be something, So we like that level of mystery as well. But we noticed that there wasn't really a reason why, I can't explain why I'm getting 60% open rates on campaign B, which has a Sage and company X subject line. But, when you drop that down to campaign E, it's only 33%. So we started looking a little bit more, and we started looking about like the month and the time of the year that we were sending these campaigns. And this might seem a little bit intuitive, but we actually tried it. And so, a lot of people may not have the guile to try these things. So we actually intentionally sent campaigns around Christmas. I think one of our campaigns went off on December 23rd or December 24th. And we were trying to see, we had the messaging catered around Christmas. So it was like, hey, I realize that I'm emailing you a couple days before Christmas. Happy holidays, by the way. But we're doing this, and I'd really like to get on your calendar after the holidays are over. And then we did a similar one around Chinese New Year, which is creeping into earlier this year. And it was like, hey, I realize that the Chinese New Year holidays are coming up. But we'd love to kind of get on your calendar. It's probably not a good time, but maybe we can meet after. And, I think that, or our thought process when we were writing these emails is like, hey, nobody's reaching out to prospects the day or 2 days before Christmas. So, we might be able to like capture a kind of a window of opportunity here that maybe nobody else is bold enough to try. In reality, I think it backfired on us ultimately. And the reason is just that, if open rates are plummeting at that time, people are probably already on holiday. They're probably switched off. They're not even looking at their work email anyway. And so I think for us, it was kind of like, I think we had great intentions, and we definitely experimented intentionally. But I would be wary for you, not that you're not writing good copy around the holidays, and not that you can't use the holiday to your benefit, but it might not necessarily be in your control whether or not people open that message. So that's super important, I think. And that was our second key takeaway, is that, you can try it and take it from us. We deliberately did this, and we tried it out, and it really didn't work for us. So I would avoid emailing during major holiday seasons, and only because I think you're going to find that less people are actually going to open your emails in the first place. Point number 3, I think for us is the big thing. And I started looking at all of our reply rates by campaign. And I was kind of scanning the numbers, and you see here, this is basically a number of statistics. And I started kind of thinking, okay, I think we're doing okay on email number 1. Email 2 and 3, that's fine. Let's kind of take a look, and we can talk about that again. But email 4, the last email that you send to someone before you stop emailing them. And it doesn't matter if this is the 4th email in your sequence, or the 3rd email, or even the 8th email, if you want to really go for longer sequences. But the last email that you send, I noticed that we had something very interesting. Typically, I mean, the first one that we send, we looked at, we had like 1%, then 15%, and then 8%. And you look at campaign D, the last email that we sent was at 3%. Campaign E, the last email that we sent was at 0%. And so I'm starting to wonder, why are we seeing 15% reply rates on this last email in this specific campaign B? And I think what we found is something that you guys might find helpful. So this is a standard last email in a sequence. This is what we call a breakup email. And in some ways it references that we're not going to be emailing you again after this. And it's really important, I think, you send this because there's an idea that you want to close a loop. And closing a loop is important. It does a few things for you, which I'll talk about in a bit. But let's just take a look through this email. Hey, Kevin, it's been a couple weeks for us, but I did want to check in one final time. We're really excited about how Sage is growing, and we think because our customers on average are seeing 20 to 50x ROI from working with us, do you think there could be an opportunity for us to connect about some ideas for your sales team within the next month or two? If not, that's okay. You can feel free to reach out to me. And then the subject line, I realized I might have had a typo when I copied and pasted this up, but the subject line here is just a standard reply. So Sage and company X, because I'm basically replying on top of my old email chain. That's what we're basically doing. You know, this is pretty much what we're doing for most of our campaigns, something along this very vanilla, you know, company seeing good ROI, you know, should we connect or not? In this specific campaign where we saw like a 15% reply rate, we changed it up quite a bit. And here's a couple of elements, or here's what it looked like. Hey, Kevin, a final note from me here so I don't wear out my welcome. I specifically wanted to work with, you know, your company on professional learning, on the professional learning file. I think Sage is uniquely placed to add some great value. Recognizing your time constraints, perhaps you could give me a yes, no, or a not now on having a sit down to talk this over. If I don't hear back from you, I'll file it as a not now and seek to connect again in a year or so. So there's three things that I think really stood out to me here, which I think folks might want to take a look at. The first is a subject line. We changed our subject line to something called check-in. In another campaign, we used checking in. So just something along those lines. I found that open rates just skyrocketed when we used the check-in subject line because it seemed a little bit new and novel to somebody. And to be honest, I think it kind of, you know, it disassociates whatever kind of they didn't reply to in the earlier emails with something brand new. We also did something which I thought was very interesting, which is we said, hey, why don't you just reply back with 1 to 2 words to let me know what you want here? And so we said yes, no, or not now. And I think for us, that call to action was just very specific. At that point, we're no longer asking for a meeting. We're no longer asking for a call. We're just asking, you know, give me a level of your interest here. We yes, no, or not now. And I think that worked quite powerfully for us. In fact, we did see that it worked powerfully. People are saying, you know, not right now, this is a good thing, but maybe not at this time, etc. And then the last thing that we did, which I thought was a little bit, which I thought was kind of interesting from our end, is we wrote this line. If I don't hear back from you, I'll file it as a not now and seek to connect again in a year or so. This I think is really important because nobody has an infinite set of target customers, right? Your ideal customer profile for most people is kind of geographically located, and it's not infinite. Maybe for some who sell like CRM software, you can really sell to an infinite number of businesses. But for a lot of people who may manage a set of accounts or a set of territories, they really only have maybe a defined number of people that they can reach out to. So you need to do basically 2 things at one time. You need to kind of create parity between you as the sales rep who's just basically cold prospecting somebody, and you know, this person who could be the CEO of a business, or you know, the head of some department, or you know, somebody who's, you know, fairly senior. So you want to create that parity. Right now, they haven't replied to you, and so you could come off as seeming like you're basically begging, and that's probably not where you want to be. So you want to at least try to close the gap in your last email. So if they ever search you again, they say, hey, this guy finished off tastefully, you know, maybe I can re-engage them in the future. And the second thing is just that you will probably need to re-engage these folks again. A good sales rep is always going to basically, churn up and maybe reach out to these guys again in 6 months, or in this case, a year. I think we need to leave that door open for ourselves to do that. It just makes whatever sequence we write in the future a lot easier. So, I really like that. And I say, for our third takeaway, I guess, is just that I think what we should be doing now is taking insight from that specific breakup email and putting it into all of our campaigns, which is, we want to change the subject line, maybe use something like checking in, check in. I want to give these guys something which is just, changing the call to action on that last email, which is, instead of me asking you for a meeting, maybe I'll just ask you for you to reply yes, no, or not now. And then the third thing is, we got to leave the door open, because for a lot of us, we need to reach out to these people again, whether we like it or not. We might think that our solution is kind of right in their wheelhouse. And so we're going to keep, this is a long play. This isn't a one and done. So writing something at the end which says, if you don't reply, I'll just, feel free to reach out to you again, or I'll reach out to you again maybe if it's a better time in a year. I think that kind of leaves the door open for you to recycle these. So I think, in sum, that's our main takeaways there. We did a lot of looking at reply and interested rates, and we tried to see where the gaps were there. I think we're going to avoid emailing during major holiday seasons next year or this year, and I think we're going to relook the way that we think about those last emails in the sequence.
Yeah, Stephen, we're right on about half an hour, so I want to be mindful of the time here, but still, there's one or two things that I thought are maybe worth chasing you up on here a little. One, the analysis is really interesting, and I think what something that we've been able to learn is things that instinctively seem right can be proven right, such as the kind of voice you're talking about. It's like, close the door, but don't lock it. In this last email, and then things that intuitively seem right actually can be proven wrong, such as, well, if we email a bunch of people in that pre-holiday season, they'll be really relaxed and interested in coffee meetings and so forth. Take me into one of the things that runs through this whole line, and the guests here too, on A/B testing. Maybe just say another word or two about how you think about A/B testing.
Yeah. A/B testing for me is very important. I think a lot of people get A/B testing wrong in that they don't isolate one specific variable that they're trying to look at. So when we talk about A/B testing, I think for me, it's I'm looking at nuances in subject lines, and everything else is consistent. Or I'm looking at just the way I phrased maybe my first paragraph, my opening, and everything else is consistent. And it could be like that. So I think that the most important thing is we do a lot of A/B testing. For this webinar, I tried to just kind of make general insights. I didn't bring in a lot of the A/B things that we were looking at. But generally, I would say this. One is isolate one specific variable when you're A/B testing. Try that thing out 3 times. Figure out which one is working the best, and then use that as your baseline moving forward. So if you find, okay, I tried out this subject line 3 different times against its competition subject line, and this was the subject line that worked best for me, I would go with that as your baseline moving forward. And maybe you can now look at isolating another variable. That's important. Another thing that we tried to do a little bit in last year was A/B test the tone of our emails. So whether we were looking at something that was more respectful or something that was trying to push the prospect a little bit. But there's an infinite amount of things that you can A/B test. I think just pick out one thing and test that 3 times, and then you should have kind of a good amount of data.
You're also talking about the size of the cohorts. Obviously, that matters. An A/B test with 5 folks and then another 5 folks doesn't necessarily have the kind of relevance. So what do you think is appropriate volumes against which people can look at the kind of data that we've been looking at?
Yeah, I think I know you have some ideas on this as well, Kev. But for me, it's It just depends on what your target audience is. If you're emailing similar types of people, I'd look at sending campaigns that are about 100 at a time. I think if you look at things that are about 100, and again, this is very subjective based on your target market, but for Sage, if we can run, a campaign with 100 people, and then we can do that 12 times throughout the year, I think that we've got enough data to kind of make some inferences. Noticing that we're mostly emailing people in Singapore who have, very distinctive types of titles. And
Yeah.
we're not sending newsletter type of content, because that's entirely different.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, look, we're at about 30 minutes. We wanted to keep this one pretty short. There's clearly plenty more that we can cover, but why don't we wrap this one up here? We'll get back with subsequent webinars on the theme, so that we don't need to kind of carry this one on too long. Yeah.
Sweet. Thanks, Kev. Thanks for having me on.
Okay. Take care.
All right.
And we'll catch up with everybody soon. Bye.